The second half of June 1942. Sex can be an act of love, an act of domination, or even a weapon. Sexual violence has been a companion to war for at least as long as we have any records. In June 1942, the Japanese Empire completes a system of institutionalized rape that has few, if any, equals in history: the comfort stations. This is War Against Humanity, a sub-series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. In the first half of June 1942, the head of the Sicherheitsdienst and military dictator of the Nazi protectorate in the Czech half of Czechoslovakia, Reinhard Heydrich, succumbed to the wounds inflicted in a May 27 attack by Czechoslovakian agents who were then hunted down and died in a desperate last stand after holding out for hours with pistols only against 750 Waffen-SS soldiers armed to their teeth. Retribution by the Nazis during and after these events have or will cost over 5,000 Czechoslovakian men, women, and children their lives. Some of them, and many more, are now locked up in concentration camps. In occupied Poland, the death factories continue to pick up pace at terrifying rates, killing tens of thousands day in and day out. News of the German attempt to exterminate all of Europe's Jews reached Great Britain and was published in newspapers across the Western Allied world. In Amsterdam, a 13-year-old Anne Frank began her diary that will outline the suffering of Jews in hiding from the Nazis like no other document. The British tried to repeat the terror bombing of Cologne over Essen, but were largely unsuccessful. Now, at the end of June, the next 1,000 bomber raid flies towards a German inner city. The night from June 25th to June 26th, head of RAF Bomber Command Arthur Harris sends his air fleet out to target Bremen, killing 85 and making around 2,500 German homeless. It is more destructive than Essen, but nothing close to Cologne or even earlier, more limited strikes on Lübeck and Rostock. It sets off a renewed questioning within the RAF and British government of how meaningful the strategic bombing idea is. And while the British government and armed forces have qualms about killing thousands of Germans, there are no such qualms on the German side. It has now been a year since Germany invaded the USSR and the genocide of Europe's Jews began. First with the instigation and promotion of pogroms by local anti-Semites, then by mass shootings through the Einsatzgruppen and their auxiliaries, and now by systematic gassing in the SS extermination factories in what the Nazis consider the final solution to their Jewish question. Even now that the murders have been industrialized, the murder by hand and gun continues. On June 13th, the last 5,000 Jews living in the Rovno ghetto are rounded up and liquidated, bringing the total death toll there to 30,000. One German engineer witnesses the event and gives a detailed description of the razzia. Shortly after 2200, the ghetto was encircled by a large SS detachment, about 3 times as many members of the Ukrainian militia. The people were driven out of their houses in such haste that small children in bed had been left behind in several instances. In the streets, women cried out for their children and children for their parents. That did not prevent the SS from driving the people along the road at running pace and hitting them until they reached a waiting freight train. Carriage after carriage was filled, and the screaming of women and children and the cracking of whips and rifle shots resounded unceasingly. All through the night, these beaten, hounded, and wounded people moved along the lighted streets. Women carried their dead children in their arms. Children pulled and dragged their dead parents by their arms and legs down the road toward the train. Again and again, the cries, "Open the door! Open the door!" echoed through the ghetto. They are driven out into the nearby town of Kostopol, where they are shot and killed to become nameless victims in a long, long list of dead men, women, boys, girls, and infants. It includes 210,000 Baltic and German Jews murdered in Lithuania and Latvia, over 30,000 killed at Babi Yar Kiev, roughly the same in Odessa, the 25,000 victims of the Bodkanovka camp, more than 23,000 murdered at Kamianets-Podilsky. In Cherno, tens of thousands of Jews from the Vaterland. In Bivshech, roughly 93,000 Jews from the Lublin, Lvov, and Krakow districts. Between 90,000 and 100,000 Jews from Slovakia, Germany, Austria, the Lublin district at Sobibor, and so on for seemingly forever. It's hard to narrow down the exact numbers by a given date, but 1 year into the killing, it's roughly 1.5 million human lives cut short. To put that into perspective, that's over 4,100 people killed every day, the equivalent of taking 2 average-sized U.S. public schools, rounding up all the kids and their parents and killing them all. And the next day, all the families of 2 more schools, and so on for a year. The entire families of 730 schools gone forever. While there seems to be no escape for Europe's Jews, the refugee stream escaping the Japanese conquest of Burma is now safely harbored in Assam, India. You might remember that the crisis that cost at least 80,000 lives was largely due to inadequate preparations by the governor of Burma, Reginald Dorman Smith's administration. For the past months, it has been a source of a fairly public reckoning between various government officials across the British Empire, especially in India, where the surviving refugees have now arrived. In April, a partisan, unofficial commission created by the Indian Congress Party has reported to the government in Delhi that Indian refugees had been not only disfavored for evacuation, but suffered racial abuse and segregation on the paths to India. They even claimed that there had been isolated cases of rape and murder of Indian refugee women by British soldiers. Now, some of that might be exaggerated, but how much and what is fact becomes irrelevant in the debate. What is definite fact is that the evacuation had been organized under strict racial segregation along 4 routes. Europeans and Anglo-Indian women and children were permitted to use the 2 safer, reinforced, partly paved roads and were cared for with fairly adequate provisions like RAF airdrops of supplies and proper camp way stations. The other 2 routes, reserved for Indians, were treacherous paths through the jungle where only rudimentary preparations and inadequate provisions had been made. It was along the Indian routes that the vast majority of deaths occurred. With India now a potential theater of war, the British were cautious to create more ethnic tension and started looking for ways to placate the calls for better preparation and equal treatment when receiving the refugees in Assam, while keeping the debate and conflict out of the public eye. The latter failed in early May when the story broke in the press in England. Progressive activist Freda Cook wrote to Churchill, "I wonder if you realize the awful despondency which fills the hearts of sensitive British people when they read the account of our discrimination against Indian refugees in Burma. The government in London manages to thwart the public relations crisis with a PR campaign that whitewashes the whole issue and assures the public that no discrimination had taken place and all has been well prepared by the government for the arrival in Assam." Both were outright lies. You see, on all the political side, across all ethnicities, for all the public assurances, accusations, and grandstanding, the politicians aren't able to do much. Red tape and the simple fact that whatever everyone professes, the refugees are not exactly a welcome burden on anyone stands in their way. Despite that, the end of the refugee crisis is a relative success thanks to a huge private initiative. It is the Indian Tea Association, ITA, the interest organization of the mostly European ethnicity owners of the vast tea plantations in Assam and their 1 million employees of local ethnicities who step in and take over the task of supplying the refugee stream on their last stretch through Burma and across the border. The ITA also finances, builds, and organizes most of the refugee camps in Assam, while the politicians bicker and point fingers in Delhi and London. So now, as June ends, all of the refugees are housed in fairly sanitary conditions, and although disease and physical effects of their trying escape continues to take its toll among them, they are safe. It will be a bitter rescue, though, as after the war they will find themselves unwelcome in both their native India and adopted Burma. They are not the only ones who will face life-lasting public stigma because of how the war affected their lives. In a more perverse and more immediate personal way, that will also be the fate of at least 200,000, possibly many, many more women and girls at the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army as now, by the end of June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army has fully staffed its army brothels or comfort stations. Women tricked, abducted from their homes, or simply selected from internment camps and forced into prostitution. Most of them young women in their 20s, but some as young as 15 and a few in their 30s or older. They are Japanese, Taiwanese, Philippine, Chinese, colonial European, and Korean, with a vast majority of the latter ethnicity. Ethnic prejudice in Japan against Koreans goes far back. Japan has held the peninsula under increased domination since 1910. When the Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937, the racial abuse by the Japanese took on an even more systematic character. Koreans were now subject to forced labor, abduction into the lethal human experiments as part of the Unit 731 program, and forced to satisfy the Japanese fighting men's sexual desires as comfort women. The sexual enslavement system is expanded into occupied China as they advance, and now in 1942, to the newly occupied territories. Okay, so Anna has covered the history of the Japanese approach to sex and prostitution in the early 20th century in an On the Homefront episode about the changing role of the Japanese geishas. You'll find a link to that video in the description. As we explore in that episode, there is an outspoken tolerance of male entitlement to the female body in Japanese pre-World War II society. In the war, this takes on an even more sinister role as the addition of racist ideas and superiority unleashes a tidal wave of institutionalized rape on both the civilian women and girls who happen to land in the way of the Japanese advance and those who find themselves captured in the comfort station system. These brothels that are administered and organized as part of official Imperial Army policy are by the summer of 1942 to be found across Japan's new empire in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Indochina, China, Thailand, and the Philippines, as well as on some Pacific islands. The women and girls live in filthy, unsanitary huts and sheds. They are paid little to nothing as their official compensation is withheld to pay for clothes, food, shelter, and sanitary products. The latter is not intended to make the women feel better, but to improve the experience of the men who assault them. Every day, each woman or girl is raped by 10 to 30 or sometimes even 40 Japanese soldiers. Army regulations allots 30 minutes to each rapist to have their way, although in peak times, like during preparation for a battle, for example, the allotted time for each soldier can be as little as 5 minutes. Little to no measures are taken to prevent the women from being infected with sexually transmitted disease or getting pregnant. Some men wear condoms, but the officers who get to go first mostly don't. Japanese military doctors abort any pregnancies, and the women are put right back to work. Women suffer from constant infections and wounds, but they have to keep going even while menstruating. If they resist, or if the men feel like living out their sadist lusts, they are subject to beating, even stabbing. One Korean woman, Gi Yong-soo, will remember. I was the youngest among us. The proprietor told me to go into a certain room, but I refused. He dragged me by my hair to another room. There I was tortured with electric shocks. He was very cruel. He pulled out the telephone cord and tied my wrists and ankles with it. Then, shouting, "Konoyaro, you rascal!" he twirled the telephone receiver. Lights flashed before my eyes and my body shook all over. I couldn't stand it and begged him to stop. I said I would do anything he asked, but he turned the receiver once more. I blacked out. When I came around, my body was wet. I think that he had probably poured water on me. Some are killed, others succumb to venereal disease, and many commit suicide. This is war in its most personal, terrible way. The loss of your freedom, your safety, your limbs, the control over your own body, your life. Endless suffering at the hands of other human beings. I have no way to imagine what it would be like to be in their situation, not because I'm a man, but because it's unimaginable. In 1942, some kind of personal, immediate, unimaginable suffering is the fate of countless of millions of people across the globe. be they soldiers, civilians, forced laborers, nurses, doctors, or comfort women. All of the people who have to live through this war and survive will carry the pain that they have inflicted or suffered with them for the rest of their lives, often in shame and silence, walking through a world of people just like me who cannot really understand. Never forget.